These two ladies up here are Martha and Mary. They're sisters. They have a brother, Lazarus, who has died. And these two ladies are in what we call anguish, despair. They're struggling with the idea of hopelessness. And Jesus is away. They've sent for him. And for some inexplicable reason, he waits 2 days before he starts to come back to meet with them, with these two sisters and brother that the brother's deathly ill that he loves. We'll pick up our story in John 11:20. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." She's perplexed. She's confused. It shouldn't have taken him 4 days to get here. There's something in her voice that I can hear of, "I know you care, but I'm not really sure how much." Or, "You say you've been our friend, and you say you love us. Is that really true? If you had been here, we wouldn't be in this awful predicament that we're in of despair." There's something of that in her words. And that is what happens when we're in a dark night of the soul. Those kinds of questions resonate from deep within. Verse 22, she says, "But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Now, what do you hear behind these words? I hear a usual sort of attitude from we Christians that says, surely if I do the right thing, God will do for me what I really want him to do. Now that you're here, maybe somehow you can make sense of all this. Maybe you could even raise him from the dead. That attitude is alive in every human being. And what it looks like is if you put a big circle on our chest, representing our heart or our soul, at the very center of everyone's heart is the word, or is the phrase, "my happiness." My happiness is central, is top priority, top billing. Now, sometimes we fool ourselves and say, well, my children's happiness is really top billing. It may seem that way as a parent, but in reality, even the happiness of others that we think is important is always rooted back to our own. And that will stay there unless a dark night of the soul happens and something else removes that happiness as our priority item and something else takes its place. Maybe you've been in a dark night of the soul. Sometimes it has to do with anguish or confusion or bewilderment, or you're in a situation that it's not likely to change at all. We have one of our families in our church that are going through a horrendous health situation with one of their kids. It just defies description. There's no explanation that really will help these folks in the midst of a dark night. Number two, when we're in a dark night of the soul, I need something more than a reason or an explanation. Now, that's the thing we always want. People will come to me and say, "Seth, I don't understand this. Can you make sense of this? Or why would God allow me to go, or us to go through something like this?" And I can tell you that there have been plenty of times in my years as a pastor that with some of our folks, I would have given my right arm to be able to have had an explanation that would have satisfied. But the problem is, when you and I are in the midst of dark night of the soul, we're sort of like Job. No matter how hard well-meaning people try, explanations are not what we need. In fact, there's something in us like Job that fights against that. It says that can't be all there is. There has to be something more. And that's where we find Martha. Martha is looking for a reason for this. "I know that you can do all things. Even now God will give you what you ask." This is his response. Verse 23. He said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Now, that's a strange answer, it seems like, on the surface. It sort of reminds me of Job's counselors or his friends that tried to convince him of why he was going through a dark night of the soul. Their reasons didn't help him. Or I see this and I think, wow, male person trying to explain or fix a female emotion with logic. Bad idea. That's a really bad idea. Is that what's going on here? I don't think that's what's going on here. I think what he sees is there's something deeper in his friend Martha. She's in anguish and she's in despair. Part of her is searching for something to hang on to. But she can't find whatever that is to hang on to at all. He's not addressing her head. He's addressing something in her heart that her heart longs for. Verse 24, Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. She responds, I know in my head that my brother has a get-out-of-jail-free card, that he'll be in heaven one day, and I'll be with him. But is that all that Jesus means here? On the inside of your handout, he responds, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Now, this is one of the most important verses in the whole book of John. And when you look at this, I think, wow, there's some really impactful words in this particular verse. I really think of four words that are really impactful. Second line, resurrection. That's a big word. What that means is death will not have the last say. I like that. There's always hope, even in the midst of despair. That's a big word. Word number 2, the end of the first sentence, life, resurrection and the life. He's not talking about physical life and physical death. He's talking about a spiritual life. What does it mean to be alive? When is a human being fully alive? It's an important word, life. He who believes in me will live. Is he talking about physical life? No. He's talking about personal life, real life. Even though he dies, meaning physical life, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Is he talking about physical life and physical death? No. He's talking about that even though we're going to die physically, there's something more important, and that is the life that you can find in him. Real life. That's the center of life. So, the words that strike me out of the 4, resurrection, life, and live. What's the 4th word? My number 1 word, which I skipped over, is the first one. I am the resurrection and the life. What's he saying to her? He's not saying to her, what you need are some principles and a theological study. If you study these verses, I think that'll give you hope. What he's saying here is you don't need a principle. What you need is a person. And that person is standing right in front of you. Something in that interchange, I think, begins to soften her heart. And a little flicker of hope starts to rise. Something in her heart settles as she realizes that his presence is doing something for her that no answer or principle could possibly touch. And I think she's starting to see that deity is standing right in front of her. Now the story shifts. Martha comes running back home, and she tells Mary, the teacher is on his way. And Mary hops up, and she runs out to meet him. We pick this story up in verse 29. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. When Martha reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet. Now, we have here Mary falling at his feet. Here, my friend who made these cutouts for us, I really wasn't sure what to do with Martha, because John didn't tell us how Martha came. Didn't say if she was standing there, or if she plopped to the ground in utter despair or humility. We don't know. So we went with this. But John thought it important to tell us that Mary, when she came, fell on her knees. Fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died. Now, do those words sound familiar? If you go back and look at what Martha said, they are virtually identical. So, my question is, how will Jesus relate to her? Identical words, is he going to relate in exactly the same way? He relates to her with giving her some truth to start with that provides some hope in the midst of despair, followed with his presence that sort of cements something in her heart, softens her heart. Is that what he's going to do with Mary? He's going to be a logical statement, some didactic teaching, and then come alongside her. He doesn't do that at all. His approach with her is almost 180 degrees different than how he responds to Martha. Verse 33. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Something goes on inside of him that just stops him in his tracks. It's as if he can't think of anything to say. What could be said? There's so much turmoil and sadness surrounding this whole situation that he is just not stumped, but he is just stopped in his tracks, so to speak. The first thing he says to her, verse 34, "Where have you laid him?" "Come and see," they replied. And then verse 35, my father's favorite verse in the Bible because it was the only one he memorized. For fairly obvious reasons. Jesus wept. All we've heard from him related to Mary, it's almost as if he's really not speaking to her. He's speaking to the group. But there is something welling up inside of him and coming out of him that moves him deeply. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." Now, what's going on here with Mary? Something very different. I think what's happening here is he sees what she needs is something very different from what her sister needs, even though the words are identical. And as best as I can tell, what he does is he enters her grief. I really don't know how to explain this better than just that simple phrase. There's something that just sort of in his heart he wants to penetrate into the very core of who she is and take that on alongside with her. There's something of that she needs more than a principle or more than truth or a truth that she can sort of hang her hope on. Not a principle, but a person. Now, as I think about these two ladies, I think about my own life. And I think there have been times where we've had our share of anguish and heartache, and things have been bewildering and confusing, and just like, God, when will this suffering stop? We've had some episodes that have gone on for as long as 10 years that we've dealt with. And there at different times, it appears to me that Jesus has come to me and to Mindy sort of like Martha, with some type of propositional truth that we sort of can hang our anchor on, and it will sustain us into the future. And there are times where those kinds of things aren't enough. And what we need to know is that God himself will walk with us through this with us, helping to carry our grief and our burden of grief and bewilderment and confusion with him. Fourth thing that I think about in this story is the glory of God is to be our center. Remember, we talked about earlier that the center of everybody's life when we are born is my happiness. You don't have to teach your little toddler that their happiness is the most important thing in life. They've already got that down. That's locked in solid with industrial strength Velcro. It will take an act of God to make that different. To rip off that Velcro of my happiness and to put on a different Velcro thing at the very core of who I am. And here, what Jesus calls us is the glory of God. That can be a very fuzzy word, but it's something like this. If I could just get a glimpse of the wonder of who God is and how much he loves me and how much he wants to use my life to make a difference with others. If I had any idea of the meaning and purpose that he has for me, I would gladly put that first and everything else second, including my happiness, on the outside of that. How does that happen? How do we become willing participants of that? It appears to me that the only time that happens is in the dark night of the soul or through times of suffering. Now let's look at, he comes to this situation. He sees Lazarus. He sees the tomb, all these people weeping. Verse 37. Some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Those words sound familiar? They're virtually identical to what Martha said and to what Mary said. Everybody thought the same thing. Which just illustrates my happiness is the centermost thing, and your happiness should be the centermost thing for you. And how come this isn't working? Jesus once more, deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Now, it's the second time that John records he was deeply moved. The first time, he was nowhere near the tomb. The second time, he's approaching the tomb, and he's deeply moved again. Now, I've been to a fair number of funerals, one of the advantages of old age. And I've watched a lot of people blubbering at the cemetery. And I've done my share of blubbering at the cemetery. Probably the hardest ones were burying my father and my mother. It's really hard to stand there at the cemetery and watch somebody that you grew up with, who took care of you, and whose body is now in this rectangle box. And you know, thankfully, that they're in heaven, which is good, but there's something very disconcerting about this whole situation. Is that what deeply moves him? Is that why he's troubled in spirit? Verse 39, take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor. Leave it to a woman to think about all the details. This is not a good idea. He's been in there 4 days. Jesus said, did I not tell you, if you believed, you would see the glory of God? What's going to happen when Lazarus comes walking out of the grave? Will that be enough to convince them? For a few it did. For most it didn't. Not even a resurrection from the dead, somebody 4 days. But what Jesus sees is, it's not the miracle that's going to make a difference. Is if these people have a chance to see the wonder of who God is through this experience, that can be a game changer. When does this happen? When the glory of God and the wonder of who He is now velcroed into that center spot of who we are. When does that happen? It seems to me that it happens in one of two ways. Either, number one, our way of trying to achieve happiness is not working. We keep bumping our head into that wall and getting bloodied. And we try again, and we try again, and we try again. We give up on that wall, and we try this approach, only to run into that wall. And we try this way, only to run into that wall. And we try this way, only to run into that wall. And then, and only then, when a human being has exhausted every possible way of achieving what I want inside of me to feel happy for a prolonged period of time, then a human being will say, I wonder if my approach is faulty. I wonder if what's at the very core of who I am is the wrong thing to start with. That's one way that happens. That's similar to my story and how I came to faith as a college student. The second way is when we have a chance to see a glimpse of who God is that's a game changer. Now, one of the ways I see this in the lives of a number of people is there are times when people are moving in all these different directions and they have an epic fail, as we call it in our current culture, an epic fail. And they say to themselves, I can't believe I did this. I knew better. I know better than to do that, but I went ahead and did it anyway. And they are mortified. They're humiliated. The shame of this is just overwhelming to them. And it's almost like they can't shake this. We call this skeletons in the closet. At midnight, they're trying to go to sleep. It's dark in the house, and they can see the light on the ceiling, and they can't go to sleep. They wake up in the morning before the alarm clock, just beating themselves silly. There comes a moment when we see the wonder of who God is, the grace of God, and that the grace of God beats every epic failure, period. And I no longer need to carry this shame or this burden around or beat myself up. In fact, it's sort of a slap in the face of God if I do. I don't need to do it anymore. There really is no need to do that. It can be either of these things. Now, as Jesus looks around this situation, he is not deeply moved and troubled because Lazarus is dead. Because he knows Lazarus is going to be alive in just a few moments. He is deeply moved and troubled, sorrowful, because all the people there are like the people we've described here. Circle, center, my happiness. And that the treasure that their heart really longs for is standing right in front of them, and not a one sees it. It drives them kind of nuts. They took away the stone, verse 41. Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. And then he prays what seems like a very odd prayer. If I had been him, I would have said, okay, I'm really out on the limb here. I'm about to say, Lazarus, come forth, and the guy's been dead 4 days. If you don't come through, I'm sunk. That's not his prayer. It's not even remotely close to his prayer. There's something else that has his attention here. I knew that you would always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here. What? That they may believe that you raised him from the dead? No, not big enough. It's not going to jar us in our heart. It's not going to rip that Velcro of happiness from the center of who we are. His prayer is that they may believe that you sent me. That I am the one that really is for them, and that I come gift wrapped from you to these people. They need to see that through this miracle. The point is not the miracle. The point is not Lazarus. The point is for them to see who he is. Perhaps they'll be awakened, is his prayer. Verse 43. When he had said this, what seems to us like an odd prayer, Jesus calls in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. Wouldn't you have liked to have been there? The dead man, John records, came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen, which is the grave clothes, and a cloth around his face. I sort of have a picture of it's kind of a mummy, sort of walking out something like this, trying to get one arm up so he doesn't run into the wall of the cave there. It must have been some type of clownish thing at one level. But can you imagine the people watching this? Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Verse 45. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary had seen what Jesus did, put their faith in him. Now, is that a good thing? Is it a good thing that they put their faith in him because they saw a miracle? Or is the kind of faith Jesus is after something very different than that? It is. The last part. His love for you is extremely costly. When Jesus saw her weeping, the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled, as we saw. That phrase, deeply moved in spirit, occurs twice. Verse 38, Jesus once more deeply moved came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Now, we really don't have a good word, English word, for that phrase, deeply moved. It's one Greek word. But as best as I can tell, that one Greek word is made up of sort of two of our words. One is groaning. Ugh. And anger. Ugh. Something is not right about this situation. Something stinks about this situation. Something needs to be done about this situation. Now, what does he see? What is it that deeply moves him? I think what he sees in this whole situation are several things. Right now, Satan is winning. And there's groaning and anger. Right now, a lie is being perpetrated, and that is, even at that moment, we really don't need God in a functional sense. What we need to do is get God to meet my happiness. That's what's important. And that's a lie. That lie is winning. A third thing that's winning is evil is winning. You ever have those situations, sometimes when you read the news, especially, and you think, where is our country going? What has happened to it? And you sort of have this groaning and a little bit of anger mixed with that, and you think, something's got to be done about this, but you feel sort of helpless to do that. That's something of here. Death is winning, not just physical death. That's not what he's talking about here. Real life and personal death. Personal life, personal death. As long as happiness is Velcro to the center of who I am, I'm going to keep running into walls. No matter how hard I try, no matter which way I move. Death is winning and suffering is winning. And there's something in him that says, this has got to change. Something must be done. And he knows what must be done. He knows he's got to call Lazarus out of the grave. Now, the problem with that is, up until this time, this is near the end of his ministry. And he knows he's on his way to Jerusalem pretty soon. And he knows that he's going to be arrested and be betrayed and beaten and cruelly dealt with and die a horrible death. He knows that that's sometime down the road. He knows that the Pharisees have been thinking about this for a while. But he also knows, with a target on his back, that if he calls Lazarus out of the grave now, that's a game changer. He has just walked into the point of no return, where these guys will make sure that he dies. If he calls Lazarus out of the grave, he knows that he has just signed his own death warrant. You can put the posters everywhere you want it, except they don't say wanted dead or alive. They just say wanted dead. He's deeply moved and troubled, I think, by all of this. When the chief priests and Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin, this is verse 47, what are we accomplishing? After Lazarus rise from the dead, they asked. Here is this man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. Then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Our place. That's their happiness. At the very center of who they are. They like life like this. And for them, they think it's working. We can't have that. And so, verse 53, John records, so from that day, they plotted to take his life. What happens here in front of that tomb? Jesus looks and sees that Satan is winning. And he knows the only way to beat Satan is to let Satan think he's going to win by going to the cross. He knows that there's a lie being perpetrated among all the people. But the only way he knows that lie will go where it needs to, out into the pit of hell, is if he himself demonstrates my happiness is not priority. He knows that evil is winning among all the people. And he knows the only way to defeat evil is to let it come upon himself. And people gave him their worst. The only way to overcome not just physical death, but personal death is for him to succumb to both. And the only way that he's going to overcome suffering for us is to take our suffering upon himself. That happens at the cross. I wonder as this happens, and we'll close with these verses, I wonder if passage Isaiah 53 comes to his mind. We call it the passage of the suffering servant. It's a passage written about 700 years before the event we've looked at today, a picture of the coming Messiah. Verse 4 of Isaiah 53 says, surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Sorrows that these two ladies had just didn't disappear. They went somewhere. He came over and he took hers, some of it at least at the beginning, eventually all of it. And he came over and entered her sorrow, her grief, took some of it then, We'll take all of it eventually. Surely he took up our infirmities, carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. He certainly was. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed by Satan and the lie and evil and death and suffering. For our iniquities, the punishment that brought us peace was upon him. And by his wounds, we are healed. Let's pray together. Father, happiness is velcroed with industrial strength Velcro at the very core of our souls and our hearts. And it makes perfect sense for it to be that way at one level. But as we live our lives, what we should discover is that that's a recipe for a mess, and lots of messes. But we will never give that up, not willingly, until we see the price you paid, that you could be the center of our hearts and our souls and our lives. And as the only one where we can find our deepest and fullest joy and peace. If there are folks here this morning that have not made that transition, that have not willingly said, this is what keeps messing me up, the very core of who I am, I think I deserve a certain amount of happiness, and I should have a certain amount of happiness. And today you see that not as an asset, but as a debit, as an arch enemy, something to be placed outside as a second thing, but not a first thing. And to let Jesus Christ be your central hope, reason for life, and source of joy, and source of peace, like he was to these two ladies, Martha and Mary. Lord Jesus, today, would you do in our hearts the work of peeling back the industrial Velcro that we have our hands clenched around. Overcome even our clenched hands. And help us to see our need of you at the center of who we are. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.